Soon after the Greek philosopher Pythagoras crossed the Adriatic Sea from his native island of Samos, arriving at the Italian city of Crotona, it is said that he was hounded by local youngsters. They had heard from the sailors on whose ship the foreigner had arrived that he could perform marvels such as none had seen before. For example, while fasting and meditating, he had made a terrible storm abate. He at first told them that these miracles were not really performed by him, but through him, and ascribed them to the One, to hen in Greek. From curiosity over supernatural phenomena, the youngsters now turned to curiosity over philosophy, asking that this Greek teach them about his mysterious, single transcendent God. The philosopher's response, however, was disappointing to the more ruckus among the Crotonan youths, as he told them that to know God is to worship him, and to worship him is to do good works. Well, what good works should we do? They pressed. Works such as might honor your father and mother, and be a credit to your families, he answered. Pythagoras had seen how brashly they spoke to a stranger, indeed one very much their senior, for Pythagoras would have been about 40 when he arrived to Italy. And so he thought it best to first teach them filial piety, loyalty to father and mother and to their elders, and so recommended that they go ahead to their homes and do their duties as good children. But there was actually a subtle lesson here, as Iamblichus relates in his biography of Pythagoras. For the priority which a parent has over a child in time, in terms of the order in which they come into the world, is an analogy, a metaphor, a living metaphor for the priority which heaven has over humanity, God over all things. The structure of reality, including biological reproduction, reveals something about God's intention in creating the world. We read, quote, Pythagoras, being surrounded with a crowd of young men, he is said to have delivered an oration to them, in which he incited them to pay attention to their elders, evincing that in the world, in life, in cities, and in nature, that which has a precedency is more honorable than that which is consequent in time. In a similar manner, he observed that natives were more honorable than strangers, meaning in a given nation or city. You give precedence to the native. Heroes than men. The authors of generation are more honorable than their progeny. Parents over children, and then this is key. He said these things, however, for the sake of providing by induction that children should very much esteem their parents, end quote. So Pythagoras preached a very conservative ethic, and he was also very pro-marriage, by the way. Pythagoreans didn't consider a married woman to have lost anything of holiness on account of no longer being a virgin the way certain other religious groups did. And with respect to Pythagoras' theology, we read, quote, Since God is, and is the Lord of all things, it is universally acknowledged that good is to be requested of him. Those things are to be done in which God delights. It is, however, not easy for a man to know what these are unless he obtains this knowledge from one who has heard God or procures it through divine art. Hence also the Pythagoreans were students of interpretation of the benevolence of the gods, end quote. The gods for Pythagoras are a subordinate species. In modern Christian terms, we would say angels. What Greek philosophical tradition calls gods, the Christians generally describe as angels, angelic intelligences. Pythagoras also, just to emphasize the point of his sense of the transcendence of God, his monotheism, we would say, banned his followers from wearing any image of God, God being beyond all images. So he had a sense of idolatry. Iamblichus's biography of Pythagoras refers to this, and the much earlier Plutarch writes that since Pythagoras viewed God as beyond form, the Pythagorean king of early Rome, Numa Pompilius, banned the use of images in temples so that the early Romans didn't use depictions of the divine in their worship. That came later. Not surprisingly, many of the local parents found Pythagoras' teachings amenable, and he soon developed a community of followers in Crotona. Philosophy was suddenly fashionable, and being known as a student of Pythagoras became a status symbol, whereupon a wealthy man by the name of Sylon approached the newcomer. Sylon's experience in life had hitherto been that the status a man has in the world is a purchasable commodity, and so he offered Pythagoras money to take him as a student. The sage, however, refused. Quote, Sylon the Crotonian held the first place among the citizens for birth, renown, and wealth, but otherwise he was a severe, violent, and turbulent man, and of tyrannical manners. He had, however, the greatest desire of being made a partaker of the Pythagorean life. We are told that Sylon's physiognomy and gestures bespoke a temperament ill-suited to philosophy, and so he was entreated to be pious and do good works, but was barred from joining the inner circle of Pythagoras. The Greek would not take him as a student. Literally, in the biographies of Pythagoras, we read that he did a physiognomy check on Sylon and decided, no, this guy is not worthy. And that physiognomy check included his general behavior, not just the look of him. Quote, physiognomically, also considering the natural indications of their frame, Pythagoras took them to be manifest signs of the unapparent manners of the soul, end quote. Sylon, having applied himself to Pythagoras, was rejected. In consequence of this, therefore, he and his friends exercised violent hostilities against Pythagoras and his disciples. End quote. Jealous of those possessing something he could not buy, and not particularly endeared by the intangible goods of family loyalty, worship of the one true God, etc., that the Greek had brought to his city, Sylon began trying to drive Pythagoras away. To this end, he found a formidable ally in a man called Ninon. Quote, the multitude being assembled together, Sylon and Ninon, who were rhetoricians, accused the Pythagoreans, and of these one belonged to the class of the rich, but the other was a plebeian. They also divided their harangues between themselves, Ninon pretending that he had explored the secrets of the Pythagoreans, end quote. Ninon preached radical egalitarianism to those persons in Crotona who had either fallen short of the Pythagorean school's barriers to entry or generally mistrusted philosophy and the new religious ideas. Why should some be esteemed above others? Are we not all equally able to perceive reality? Do you suppose you do not know as much truth as any other person who lives or has ever lived? That was Ninon's whole doctrine. His social egalitarianism was based on a flat epistemology, we could say a materialistic worldview. He was an empiricist, uninterested in the spiritual and logical disciplines that reveal deeper truths below the surface layers of human experience, and his anti-philosophy did catch on in Crotona. He was supported by the rich man Sylon, who hated anything he could not buy, and soon a mob was roused, killing some Pythagoreans, some followers of Pythagoras, and driving others out of the city into exile. The ubiquitous idea that there are occult secret societies to which the elite belong finds a symbolic patron in Sylon, persons who want to access spiritual knowledge for which they are not qualified, resentful that worldly power doesn't buy them the fruits of the Spirit, set up a counter-tradition, an inverted initiatic path. Just a bit of a side note. Pythagoras himself was either in Delos at the time, or went there presently during the turmoil, immigrating with the families of his students to the community near the Greek temple at Delos, where he was held in high esteem by the priests, who considered him a manifestation of the sun god and a messenger of the divine. Following his death, however, the Crotonan followers of Pythagoras were invited to return to their native city, where their property was restored by a later government that was actually pro-Pythagoras and regretted what had happened. Sylon and Ninon, the rich materialistic elite, and the communist rebel-rouser had fallen into disfavor, and a new governor wished to make amends. So what can we learn from this? On one level, the idea of the super-rich promoting egalitarian, revolutionary, anti-spiritual materialistic movements really does define a lot of modern history. So In Sylon and Ninon, and the war on Pythagoras, we really have a very interesting precedent for a lot of what we've seen in the West. The idea of non-purchasable goods and of knowledge requiring spiritual piety, logical thoroughness, etc. can indeed be an impediment to the Cylons of the world, as can a strongly pro-family worldview which Pythagoras was espousing, and which will always interfere with naked market logic and political control and tyranny. In their fight against religion and family, Sylon types will often mobilize Ninon types. A Ninon able to speak to the masses and whip up resentment presents a materialistic, egalitarian philosophy as somehow liberating, when in reality it only renders people more vulnerable and easier to control by the Cylons of the world. The global oligarchic project to displace religion, break down the family, and concentrate political power relies on creating an underclass of state-dependent persons who can be called upon to defend the elite's interests against positive reform. Sylon needed Ninon. George Soros needs apparently populist, but actually fake populist politicians, etc. Resistance requires asserting that truth is not purchasable and that the family and natural institutions are analogous to transcendent realities, that they are God-given. The proliferation of a flat materialistic outlook in society is a sure sign that a predatory elite is mobilizing and exerting itself behind them. Okay, I thought that episode of Pythagoras' story was interesting and relevant. Pythagoras is foundational to Greek philosophy. He's a key figure in the Western spiritual tradition, the archaic roots of Europe. I fictionalized his arrival to Italy using Neoplatonic terms and have drawn mainly on Iamblichus, a Neoplatonist, because I take the core of Pythagoreanism to be preserved in Middle and Neoplatonic writings. That tradition regards him as a divinely inspired messenger, and we could frame him as a prophet in biblical terms, possibly. In fact, interestingly, some Sufi mystics, like the Persian Surawardi, did treat Pythagoras and other Greek philosophers as messengers from heaven. So there is a tradition of this Neoplatonic conception surviving into the Middle Ages. In the future, I may make occasional videos on episodes of Pythagoras' life and the lives of other prophetic figures like Numa Pompilius from the European past. Thank you very much for watching. As always, there's links in the description to ways to help the channel and social media and such, and subscribe if you would like to. Until next time.